All right, so if you heard my talk earlier, that one I didn't have any advance notice of, so I hadn't made any preparations. But this one I actually have visual aids and notes for. So I'm going to start these around. They're the same, so I'm just going to put one on each side so you can pass them around and look. And I'll be talking a little bit about what's on those as I go. My name is Alena Van Arendonk. I am the secretary of the Historical Society. I've been on the board for 18, 19 years, something like that. I've lost count, I don't know, a while. So I'm very familiar with not only what's in this building, but also just our general local history. And we have some new exhibits that we're very excited about, so I'm going to give you the background on one of them. Most Hoosiers are aware of Indiana's state motto, which is the Crossroads of America. But a lot of people don't realize exactly how much of a role transportation played in our state's early history. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Indiana was actually one of the national leaders in transportation technology. Now, this was largely a matter of location for a number of reasons. For one thing, the National Road passed right through the middle of the state, and that was one of the main routes linking the eastern and western halves of the U.S. in the days before the development of the interstate system, which didn't happen until the 1950s and in some areas later. The National Road was renamed US 40 later, and you know it as Washington Street, where it passes through Indianapolis. Indiana was also strategically positioned to take advantage of commercial traffic on both Lake Michigan and the Ohio River, which were key cargo routes during the 19th century because overland transit was slower and unreliable. A lot of commercial goods and people traveled by water in those days, and to a certain extent still do. So two of the largest shipping hubs in the country were Chicago and Cincinnati, and since Indiana touches both of them and is right between those two, an enormous amount of raw materials, commercial traffic, passenger traffic traveled through the state on a daily basis. And much of that was by railroad, which had come to Indiana in the 1830s and continued expanding throughout the 19th century. By the mid-19th century, in the 1850s, Indiana had become a major rail hub. We developed the first Union Station in the world, which by 1900 was serving over 200 trains a day. That's a lot of traffic, because those trains were not short trains either. Also, personal transportation was at the forefront in Indiana, and especially in the late 1800s, we had bicycle clubs forming. One of those was the Indianapolis Zigzag Cycle Club, which was in primarily the 1890s, I believe. The members of that included Carl Fisher, who would later go on to co-found the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and Franklin Township resident and inventor Garrett Henricks, who invented a couple of things. He patented the magneto that was used in cars and boats for decades and is now in the Smithsonian, and he also invented the engine choke, although he did not get the patent on that because it was stolen from him. Hi.
It was actually in the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry rather than the Smithsonian.
What she said. And Garrett Henricks is buried over in Pioneer Cemetery at Southport and Combs Road, and his descendants are still living in the township. In fact, some of them are in this building right now. Spoiler, I'm one of them. In the early 20th century in Indiana, automobile racing and auto polo were popular sports. If you're not familiar with auto polo, it's exactly what it sounds like. It was playing polo with cars instead of horses. Extremely dangerous. Of course they did. And that's in part because Indiana was also home to more than 80 automobile manufacturers in the early 20th century, including some of the biggest names in classic cars like Duesenberg, Packard, Studebaker, Auburn, Cord, names you've probably heard of. We were an automobile center, and we were actually kind of feuding with Detroit. Detroit was Motown, but we also had a lot of cars. So most people, thanks to surviving institutions like the Indy 500, we have the Monon Trail and the Pennsy Trail, people are at least familiar with the transportation methods that were here, and we have a basic concept of the state's historic relationship with transportation because they affect what we're doing now. But there's one mode of transportation that's often overlooked in these retrospectives, and that was not only at the center of daily life for many Hoosiers in history, but also had a direct and profound impact on the economic and urban development of a lot of the smaller communities in Indiana, including those right here in Franklin Township, and that is the Interurban, which of course is what this talk is about. Interurbans were electric light rail streetcars that carried passengers between cities, also through cities, but primarily between, hence the name Interurban, between the cities. And they developed in part following a massive outbreak of equine influenza in the 1870s that killed thousands of horses and pretty much brought the transportation industry to a standstill because all the horses were sick. The freight couldn't be carried. Nobody could move things. The streetcars stopped because in those days they were horse-drawn. Excuse me. So after the transit industry was crippled for months because of the equine influenza outbreak, interest in public transportation that was not horsepower driven skyrocketed, and a lot of industries began development on alternate means of transportation. Thomas Edison was involved in a lot of this, all of the foremost inventors of various technologies, especially those involving electricity. So the accelerated interest and research led to the rapid development of electric vehicles. And by the late 1890s, electric streetcars had largely replaced horse-drawn transportation in many of America's urban centers all across the country. And it didn't take long before that service also expanded to run between cities instead of just around on the city streets. In Indiana, the construction of the first interurban networks began in 1895 with the first operational route in the state, which ran between Anderson and Alexandria, opening in 1898. So it took some time to construct, but by 1898 we had one intercity route. Indianapolis became an interurban center in 1900, January 1st, 1900, so a good start to the new century. And that was an interurban line that linked downtown Indianapolis with its southern neighbors, Greenwood and Franklin, which in those days, Greenwood and Franklin were not just suburbs, they actually were separate from Indianapolis because we hadn't had all the suburban sprawl that has now filled in the gap between the two. So they were considered different cities. And over the next few years, traction companies added hundreds of miles of track, linking towns all over central Indiana and connecting to other regional lines in Illinois, Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio. The way the interurban networks worked, even though they were run by different lines, the trains would connect, they would have depots, you could hop off one train, hop on another one, go to a different system, trade in tokens. And it was said that, in the early 20th century, you could get on an interurban train in New York and get off an interurban train in Wisconsin without taking any other mode of transportation other than interurbans all the way there. Now, that was a lot of train switching and tokens, but if you really wanted to do it, you could. However, within a decade after 1900, Indiana boasted the single most extensive light rail system in the entire United States. We had a lot of interurban tracks. One company laid over 450 miles of track just on its own, and that was in central Indiana, and then it spread outward from there. Now, this was unprecedented convenience and ease of travel between cities, because before that, you either, you could walk, you could take your own horse, you could hire a stage, you could, travel on train if you had a train, but trains didn't go to a lot of small towns, but the interurbans went everywhere. So the traction line, just to give you an idea of what kind of travel this was, the traction line that operated service between Anderson and Indianapolis carried as many as 20 million passengers in a single year. Now, this was at a time when the population of Indianapolis was only 200,000 people. 20 million is a lot of people to carry in a year. And this wasn't a government-sponsored enterprise like a lot of mass transit is today. Traction companies operated on the free market, and a lot of times you'd have multiple lines existing in the same region. By 1902, a total of 7 different light rail companies were operating in and around Indianapolis, technically in competition with each other, but they all had different train tracks. So in 1903, they joined forces to build the Indianapolis Traction Terminal, which is on that page going around that you can look at. It opened the following year at a construction cost of over $1 million. In today's money, that's over $30 million. So this was not a small project. And that was modeled on the shared track concept of the Union Station, which had opened half a century earlier in Indiana. So all of the lines shared a single depot as opposed to everybody having their own stations that you'd have to leave and walk to the next train line, which was inconvenient for travelers, especially if you were switching lines. So passengers had easy access to multiple interurban lines and the city trolleys, all from the same building, because Indianapolis at that time also had electric street trolleys that would take you to different places. So that was the largest interurban station in the world. Again, Indiana was a leader. We were basically the interurban capital of the world at that time. At its peak, the traction terminal handled 500 trains a day and 7 million passengers per year. That's only a single station with that many millions of people going through it. And again, Indy's population at the time was only around 200,000 people, which is approximately 1/10 of what the metro area population is today. So it was a much smaller city, but it still had a ton of travel going through it. Because interurban trains ran on electricity instead of steam like long-distance trains did, the expansion of the light rail system also brought electricity to many areas that hadn't previously had access to electric service. Excuse me. Installing power lines and power infrastructure was very expensive, but if you had a rail company that was footing the bill for the installation of the posts and the lines and the installation and all that, the necessary infrastructure didn't get passed on as readily to the consumer because it was part of a different industry. So even smaller rural communities could afford to buy electricity from the traction line itself. And at this time, electricity was not considered a utility the way we think of it today. Electric companies were run for profit, they could run in competition with each other, and there was very little regulation. So they didn't have to stay on all the time. They could just provide electricity when they wanted to, and the customers couldn't really do anything about that. And to further complicate matters, rail lines were sometimes leased, or tracks, sections of track rather, were leased to the electric companies themselves, who would then establish their own transportation systems and run their own trains on their own tracks. So you had the electric company operating the train system from which you were also buying your electricity. This is why we now have antitrust legislation, because this was a great racket for them. So that meant that when the Indianapolis, Shelbyville, and Southeastern Traction Line reached Franklin Township in 1902, that was the first time Wanamaker and Acton had access to residential electricity. And so now you have these towns electrified because they were too rural to support their own power company before, since the power companies were on the open market as well. However, residents who bought their electricity from the traction company did have to watch the clock because the power was only on as long as the trains were running, which meant when the last train went out of service at the end of the day, the power company would turn off the power, and they would turn it on the next morning when the first train started running the next morning. So you'd have no power overnight. So you just had to plan ahead a little bit, but that's the way the system worked. And there were, in Indianapolis, there were 12 traction lines, 12 main spokes on the wheel that went out to other parts of the state. The spoke that came to Franklin Township ran down the Michigan Road, which is now Southeastern Avenue. If you joined us this spring on our tour of the 1896 Waterman Building, or if you watched it on our YouTube channel, you probably saw Connie Waterman talking about how the 5 Points Interurban stop did not have a train shelter or a depot. Customers waiting to board the Interurban would wait in the front of the Waterman's store and just watch through the window for when the Interurban was coming. And that was not uncommon in rural areas because they didn't want to man a depot, and sometimes there wasn't a place to put a shelter. The tracks followed Southeastern Avenue all the way down into Wanamaker and went through it, and then when they reached Hickory Road, which is between Wanamaker and Acton, southeast of Wanamaker, the rails turned south, continued on toward Acton. Acton was a much larger town back then. It was actually larger than Wanamaker. It had attractions like the Acton Campground that brought people in from all over the state, thousands of visitors a year, and actually sometimes thousands of visitors a day. When the Interurban was built in 1902, Acton was a big draw. Unfortunately, in 1905, the Acton Campground fire destroyed the camp buildings, and that traffic started falling off somewhat after that point. But Acton was still a well-established town with its own railroad depot. The line followed the right-of-way of the original Indianapolis and Cincinnati Railroad. If you see on that map, it kind of jogs over. Then it briefly detoured along what was at the time Washington Street and has since been renamed Swales Street in Acton, and then it cuts back down to the railroad right-of-way and continues on to Shelbyville. So that was kind of the route it took through Acton. The Interurbans reached their peak as a mode of transportation in the 1920s. The trains ran hourly on many routes, and that was the default transportation for people who needed to travel between cities because not very many people owned their own cars. Cars were also slower and more expensive to operate. You know, your car might top out at 25 or 30 miles an hour on some of the country roads. Interurbans typically traveled 60 to 65 miles an hour, and the express trains could get up to 80 miles an hour. So it was a much faster mode of transit. But the 1930s came along, and they were very hard on transit systems, not only because the Great Depression meant they had a fall off in passengers and lower revenue, but rising competition at that point from private automobiles and from long-distance motor coaches. Buses were starting to become more popular. That cut into their revenues as well. And in 1935, new regulations for public utility companies eliminated the cheap electricity or the power companies running their own trains system. So now they had to pay more for their power, they weren't getting as much revenue from the customers, and they were facing competition from other modes of transportation. Excuse me. Added to all this, you were reaching a point, at that point you're 40 years, 50 years almost into the operation. They needed to replace the rails on some routes, their equipment was aging out of service, it was very expensive to maintain those. So during that period of time, since the rail replacement was really too costly to pursue and they weren't making as much money, they started switching to something called trackless trolleys in some areas, which were basically, they were still trolleys in that they ran along the same electric cable, but instead of running on train wheels, they had bus tires. So they were kind of a hybrid between a bus and a train system. And that wasn't so much on the long distance or interurban routes, but the ones that were more of a in the urban area or short runs tended to run on that way. Also, the downtown Indianapolis trolley system started switching to that in the 30s and 40s. A lot of the less profitable routes, including the ones that passed through Wanamaker and Acton, the ones that weren't really highly traveled by commuters, were discontinued during the 30s. I don't know the exact year. I've been unable to find the exact year it stopped here, but it was around 35, 36, somewhere in that range. And so by 1940, after the attrition and the problems they've had, only a handful of interurban cars were still in operation in Indiana, just a few, and they had all been consolidated into 1 or 2 lines. In 1941, there was a serious accident with fatalities near Columbus, Indiana, which literally halved the number of operating interurban cars in this state. There were multiple cars involved in that crash. People got injured, people got killed, and they didn't have the money to get more cars, and the state said, look, this is too dangerous. You're not maintaining things. We're going to stop. So 1941 is when the last intercity route was discontinued. Within Indianapolis, trolley service hung on until the post-war years. So into the 50s, you still had trolleys in downtown Indy, but they started being superseded by buses and cars. They went to trackless trolleys. So the last light rail car that was still in operation in Indianapolis was scrapped in January 1953, and that was the end of the classic interurban car like the ones you see on the papers going around. During World War II, there was a massive demand for scrap metal because they were building planes and things. And so that resulted in some of the interurban rails actually being torn up and melted for scrap for the war effort. Others were left in place, and then they were just paved over with later road improvements. So you don't see them very much unless you have a major road work that actually cuts down through several layers of asphalt, reaches the brick substructure, and sometimes you'll still see rails on those. But as routes were discontinued, the local stations or depots were sold or repurposed or torn down. The Indianapolis Traction Terminal, which again was the largest one in the world, operated as a Greyhound bus station until 1968 and then was demolished in 1972. The Hilton Indianapolis now stands on the former site. It was at Market in Illinois. So that's no hotel, it's prime real estate. No longer a traction station. However, if you know where to look, you can still find a few pieces of the interurban history scattered around the Indianapolis area. So the limestone eagles that flank the steps on Old City Hall downtown, if you ever drive past that, they're these spheres with big eagles on top facing left and right toward the stairs. Those were actually salvaged from the traction terminal. And if you look at the postcards on there, you can see the little tiny eagles up on columns on either side of the train shed in those photos. And unfortunately, in 2013, a crane that was hanging signage for an art exhibition knocked one over, broke it into more than 50 pieces. It was unsalvageable, but the city did hire a master sculptor to make an exact replica. So one of the eagles is original and one of the eagles has been replaced. But when you drive by, you can look at them and remember the traction terminal that used to be downtown. On East Washington Street, there's a section of original trolley track that's been preserved by the Irvington Historical Society. It's on the north side of Washington, immediately west of Audubon. So if you know where Giacomo Pizza is, it's on that block. And it's set in bricks. It's got a nice big interpretive sign that talks about the history. So you can see those. Those are original tracks that go back to the early 20th century. For several miles of Madison Avenue, south of I-465 on the south side, you may notice, if you look at a map or if you're driving, there's a second road that's typically called South Madison Avenue. It's actually west. I don't know why it's called south, but it runs parallel to Madison Avenue. It's just a single lane that's off on its own next to the main road. There's a grassy median between the two with some trees and grass there, and that is the original right-of-way for the interurban rails because they used to run down the center of Madison Avenue, and then when they widened the road later, they just widened the other side of it. So you can see where the interurban used to run between Indianapolis and Greenwood. And there are also some oversized power poles along that route that are the original traction poles that carried the heavy-duty cables to power the trolleys along that route. So you can look up and spot a few of them along Madison Avenue. And perhaps the most telling evidence is the names of the streets themselves. Because if you're on the south side of Indianapolis on your way to Greenwood, you will see roads called Stop 10, Stop 11, Stop 12, Stop 13. Those roads are named for the interurban stops because when it would go between Indy and Greenwood, it had those stops. They had to name the road something. That was the only thing there because there was no city there at the time. And that would, tell you where you were along the route. And of course, most recently, thanks to the generosity of Bill Liebkman, who donated the rails, and Green Acres Landscaping, who helped us install them, we have our very own memorial to the interurban system in the form of the rails that we have just had installed outside this past month. Those rails originally were laid on Hickory Road between Wanamaker and Acton. And they are original. They are original interurban rails that were torn out sometime in the 1940s. We don't know the exact year. But if you've not seen that exhibit, please do go outside. You can touch them, walk on them at your own risk. Please don't hurt yourself, but you can look at them, and there's a nice sign out there too. And when you're there, think about what it was like to live in this town a century ago, when you could go pretty much anywhere between New York and Wisconsin and start your journey just by hopping on the electric streetcar as it went down the street. Thank you very much.
Before you step down, maybe you could see if there's any questions.
Mm-hmm. Are there any questions? I am happy to answer questions.
Is there any rail cars that are left that we can say if we have to stop people?
There are a couple of. Oh, yes, sorry. For the sake of the video. Are there any rail cars left? And the answer to that is there are a couple that have been preserved in museums, in transportation museums. Unfortunately, most of them were just scrapped when they ended service, but there are a few. I think Terre Haute has a few, because Terre Haute was the central operation for a major interurban line. I don't know if they're in the city proper or if they're just Terre Haute cars that are preserved elsewhere. The photos that are going around have a color photo of one of the cars, and that is actually a preserved car that's still on exhibit somewhere. We don't have any in Indianapolis as far as I know. There were actually plans to reconstruct, this is really sad, it makes me depressed. There were plans to reconstruct the train shed from the traction terminal, and in the 1970s, Ruth Lilly bankrolled the deconstruction of a section of it where they took down, numbered every girder, numbered all the bricks and everything so it could be reconstructed. It was sent to a transportation museum somewhere outside of Indy, I don't remember which one, where it was stored until the mid-1980s, when the museum looked at it and said, well, this would cost too much to put back together, so they just had it hauled away for scrap. So we don't have any part of the terminal except the Eagles, which are the only things left. But there are a few interurban cars that were repurposed as things like parade floats in the 70s and 80s. Some of them were donated. So I have seen a few places that have either cars or parts of cars that you can still see. And part of the problem with them is the cars are huge. They're way bigger than what you think of as a trolley car. They're a full-length train car. And the way the interurbans ran is it was usually one car that ran on the track by itself. If they were really packed, they would have like a trailer or a second car attached to it, but each car was self-locomoting because it hooked to the line directly. So you didn't tend to have places that just wanted an interurban car parked somewhere because it would take up a huge amount of space. I did see one somewhere, I don't think it's in Indiana, but I saw one that somebody had converted into a diner. So sometimes they did get repurposed. But sadly, we didn't really think about the future when they were discontinuing that service. They were just thinking, oh, there's a war on, this has metal in it, we can sell it for scrap. And that happened to a lot of things, sadly. So, any other questions? Yes?
Also, the interurban run from downtown, Monument Circle down in that area, district to Fountain Square. And the Fountain Square, there's a restaurant called End of the Line, and that's why it was called End of the Line, because then they turned it around and it went back to the city. Yeah,
so he's saying that the Fountain Square was the end of one of the lines from downtown Indianapolis, and the restaurant is called End of the Line because it's where it would rotate and go back. There are a lot of little things in the city that have mementos, and actually Fountain Square itself, the reason Fountain Square exists is before the electric trolleys, that's where the horse-drawn trolleys stopped to water the horses. That's why there's a fountain in Fountain Square, because it was where they watered the trolley horses. Once the horses were replaced with electric cars, then they put the turntable there so they could go out, turn around, and come back. And with the interurbans, the larger cars, the long-distance cars, tended to only go between cities. Inside the city, you would transfer to a smaller trolley car that was a bit more manageable for city streets. They were not 100% without accident. There were actually some pretty bad accidents because anytime you have cars and trolleys crossing the street and foot traffic and everything else, stuff happens. So, as with any mode of transportation, you did have incidents sometimes with things going through the city, but the high-speed interurban cars were primarily from outside the city limits to the next town, and then you could board a local train, just because a lot of places didn't have trolley lines yet.
And I remember with, on They still use the tracks, but we used to call them bloom tower trolleys. That's what the slogan, slang was.
Bloom?
Bloom tower.
Bloom tire trolleys. Yeah, they started,
Have some tokens from the.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, those would be interesting, yeah. There were a lot of rate disputes in the 40s, after the end of the war, when they were regulating rates for wartime. There were a lot of rate disputes in the late 40s, early 50s with the Indianapolis railways, or Indianapolis Railroad trolleys that operated downtown. And they went through a lot of rate changes and token changes and things like that. From the 1940s, I want to say about 1946 is when they started replacing the rail cars with the trackless trolleys, and I don't know, I'm not certain on that date. And the last rail trolley went out of service in '53, but the actual, the trolley system itself that still ran on the electric lines lasted into the late '50s, but it ended up just not being profitable. People started buying their own cars after the war, a lot of things happened, and the trolleys just couldn't make enough money. And they were very high expense to maintain as well. So eventually that was discontinued. There's actually a book in the back of our building right now called Indianapolis Railways that gives a lot of history of the local city trolleys and their entire background and financial history and everything that happened with those. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I can't believe it's going on 4 o'clock. I mean, I've been here since 11, and it just doesn't seem possible that this has still been moving all this time. I want to thank you all for coming. If you did not get to see some part of this building and you're like, oh, I wanted to look at the Hoosier cabinet area or the small schoolroom or the what is it table or the dairy barn or ask questions or anything, feel free. We will be here for a few minutes yet. As Alena mentioned, the trolley tracks from Hickory Road are right outside. The tent to the left, from the inside, it's the left, to the west of them, has a video rotating pictures of this building when it was a church. So if you want to see images of what this was like before it was part of the Historical Society, feel free. Again, this is our 150th year. I think this building is doing very well for having been around that long. We are on the National Historic Register. We are registered with the state of Indiana. Indiana Landmarks comes out every year, looks at the exterior of our building, sees how we're maintaining things to keep us on track. They always give us a good report. And we are on the National Register. We would love to have you be part of all of our activities, either as a member or just to come and participate. Take home a book, something that will help keep township history alive for the current generations and future ones. So feel free to stop any of us who are wearing name tags. We'll do our best to answer questions. And again, thank you so much for coming. Please don't leave without eating and drinking more. All right, take care.